Last week I talked about the impacts of climate change, how to value them. We talked about the total welfare impacts as well as the effects at the margin, known as the social cost of carbon. So today I'm going to talk about the distribution of the impacts of climate change, and I'm going to talk about how climate change affects economic growth. So we looked at this graph extensively. One of the key things here is that this graph shows the impact of climate change to the average person on the planet, which is not particularly insightful. So I'm going to use the same information. I'm going to focus on 2.5 degrees of warming, and we're going to look at the impacts across the countries of the world. And they're here ranked according to the per capita income in the year 2005. You see a clear and distinct pattern, and that is that poorer countries are much more susceptible, much more vulnerable to climate change than our richer countries. We see that most poor countries suffer for 2.5 degrees of warming, are expected to suffer fairly negative impacts of climate change. Now there's 3 reasons for this. This is not just a correlation, we actually believe this to be causal. The first is exposure. Poorer countries have a much larger share of their economic activity in agriculture, and therefore are immediately exposed to the weather and therefore to climate change. Whereas richer countries have a much larger share of their income in services. So if your main economic activity is banking and financial services and those sort of things, then you're vulnerable to all sorts of things, but weather and climate would not be one. But if most of your economic activity is in agriculture, then you're directly exposed to weather and climate. So that is the reason why poorer countries are much more vulnerable. So the first reason why poorer countries are much more vulnerable to climate change than our richer countries. The second reason has to do with their location. So this is the same graph, same information, but now we swap the horizontal axis, and we're now displaying the current temperature averaged over that country. And what you see is that currently hot countries are much more vulnerable to climate change than our currently cold countries. And of course, poorer countries tend to be in hot places. Now the reason that hotter countries are more vulnerable to climate change is obvious, I think. A lot of plants, a lot of animals that you depend on are closer to their biophysical limits. They're sort of at the edge of their ecological niche. But also for the human aspect of all of this, I mean, if you wonder what will southern England be like after 2 or 3 degrees of warming, or maybe 4 degrees of warming, then you could look at, if you wonder what London will be like in 2080 climate-wise, then you just need to look at Madrid. And what you would notice is that buildings are different in Madrid. Buildings in England are designed to keep the heat in. Buildings in Spain are designed to keep the heat out. You would notice that people in Spain take their dinner much later than we tend to do. You would notice that definitely in the rural parts of Spain and Italy, people take a siesta. That is, they sleep through the heat of the day and everything is closed, and then when it gets cooler, things start to open again. And all of those adaptations make perfect sense as an adaptation to a hotter climate. So if you're wondering what will the UK or England be like under climate change, you just need to look at Spain, and we just need to adopt their technology and their behavior, and we'll do much better than if we stick to English behavior. So that is relatively easy. There is an analog, there is something you can copy. If you're in the hottest place on the planet, you cannot just copy the behavior of people who live in even hotter places, because there are no such people. And that means that your adaptation to climate change needs to be invented from scratch. And that is just much harder than just to copy somebody. So that is the second reason why poorer countries tend to be more vulnerable than our hotter countries. And the third reason has to do with adaptive capacity. And adaptive capacity is lower in poor countries than it is in rich countries. So what do we mean by adaptive capacity? Adaptive capacity is just a different way of saying this is the ability to adapt, not just to climate change, but to any change. And it depends on all sorts of things. Let's just focus on sea level rise. Sea level rises. What happens? Water takes away your land. What can you do about it? Well, you can build a dike, for instance. So if you have access to dike building technologies, you know how to build a dike, then you're less vulnerable to sea level rise than if you don't know how to build a dike. Now, this is not a particularly discerning technology. Dikes were invented, actually, I don't know when they were invented, but the ancient Chinese and the ancient Egyptians and the ancient Sumerians knew how to build dikes. So this is a fairly old technology. But the same goes for irrigation technology, the same goes for advanced seeds, for drought-tolerant crops, and so on and so forth. If you have access to these things, then you're much less vulnerable than if you don't have access. And one of the symptoms of underdevelopment is that you don't have access to the most advanced technologies. So that is one aspect of adaptive capacity. Going back to dike building, primitive dikes can essentially be built by anybody. Advanced dikes require a lot of engineering skills. If your country is deficient in access to, or if your country is deficient in training up engineers, then what you can do is just call in the Dutch, right, who would happily build fairly advanced coastal zone management options for you, fairly advanced water management options for you, provided that you can afford their fees. So poverty immediately excludes the most advanced options for adaptation. Countries in the world that simply can't afford to pay for certain technologies, and that then makes you more vulnerable to climate change or any other change for that matter. So those two aspects of adaptive capacity are immediate and fairly obvious. And then there's a whole range of other things that are just as important, or maybe even more important, and that are much softer and much harder to quantify and much less immediately obvious. So if you continue the story about sea level rise, and we look at Bangladesh, Bangladesh is sort of a low-lying coastal plain. It's vulnerable to floods from the river, coming down the Himalayas, and floods from the sea, typically during hurricanes. Fairly vulnerable place. Sea level were to rise by a meter or so, and about 25%, maybe 30% of Bangladesh would disappear under the sea, and it's actually the most populated part of the country. So that 30% of the land area would take 50% of the people and perhaps 60% of economic activity in the country. So it's fairly vulnerable. Do Bangladeshis know how to build dikes? Yes. Can they afford to pay for it? Probably yes. I mean, if you look at Bangladesh today and compare it to the Netherlands in 1850, and 1850 is an important date in Dutch history because that is when the modern dike building program started. Bangladeshis are not much poorer than the Dutch were 160 years ago. So the level of development is comparable. And actually, when the Dutch started building their dikes in 1850, they did not have internal combustion engines, had a bit of steam engines to power these things, but most of these dikes were built by hand. And the Bangladeshis nowadays have access to drag lines and all those sort of things that the Dutch did not have 160 years ago. So in that sense, they have much better technology. They're about as rich. So that shouldn't be the issue. So what is holding back the Bangladeshis? Why are they so extremely vulnerable to storms and floods and river floods? Well, actually, 1850 in the Netherlands is sort of the date when the modern flood building program started, but it's not when the Netherlands all of a sudden discovered the technology of building dikes. That actually goes back to the 11th century. It is not when they discovered that they were vulnerable to floods, because if you read through that history, you find loads and loads of devastating floods before 1850, so it's not as if the country suddenly woke up and said, oh my God, we are vulnerable to flooding, let's build a dike. We never thought of a dike before. No, and the reason that the Netherlands started dike building in 1850 has everything to do with the European Spring of 1848 and the Constitution of 1849. And what happened in 1848 was, of course, an uprising across Europe against the old elite. What happened in 1849 in the Netherlands is that there was a new constitution, and what did the new constitution do? Two things. It installed a powerful central government, and it installed a government that was broadly representative of the people, or rather the male Protestant part of the people. And what did the new government do? It went after public enemy number one, that is floods. Now if you compare that to Bangladesh today, what do we have? We have a government that is widely considered to be the most corrupt and incompetent, among the most corrupt and incompetent in the world. Politics in Bangladesh is about two things, right? One is getting even with your opponents, and the other is about getting rich. That is what politicians in Bangladesh do. They don't care about what is happening to the people they are supposed to govern, they are supposed to represent, the people who vote for them. People on the floodplains in Bangladesh are fairly poor, fairly ignorant. They think that floods are not something that has to do with the incompetence of the government in Dhaka, but they think it's punishment from Allah. So they won't vote against you if you let their neighbors drown, because they don't make that connection. So why would the politicians in Dhaka, which is actually relatively up the hill, why would politicians in Dhaka care about flood risks? It is just not in their interest to do so. And as long as the political situation in Bangladesh is as it is, that you have an incompetent and corrupt government who don't care about their people, there is no reason for them to start building dikes and protecting their people against flood risks. This sort of poor institutions is, of course, both one of the symptoms and one of the causes of underdevelopment. And one of the symptoms of poor governance and poor institutions is that you cannot or do not want to protect your people against what climate change would throw at them. Right? So that is the third reason why poorer countries are more vulnerable to climate change than are richer countries. Now that immediately implies that vulnerability to climate change is not static. If it is the case that poorer countries are more vulnerable to climate change than are richer countries, then if poorer countries would be countries that are poor today would be less poor in the future, then immediately they would be less vulnerable to climate change. And for sure we can say that future vulnerability will be very different from current vulnerability. Let me illustrate this with the case of malaria, which is illustrative in many different ways. What you're looking at here is a map of the change in malaria risk because of climate change. And the way to read this map is as follows. In sort of the lighter yellows, malaria incidence would increase by 10% up to 50%, and then if you get into the red areas, malaria incidence would increase by 50% up to 100%. In the purple areas, you would see malaria where it is not today, and then in the green areas, you would see those parts of the world where malaria would be less prevalent. And if you look very closely at the map, then you indeed see a few green areas. But by and large, you would see an increase in the incidence of malaria. That is for two reasons. One, if it's warmer, the parasite grows faster. So under current circumstances, the average incubation time is about 4 weeks. But if it's warmer, that goes down to maybe 3 weeks or so. So that is one reason. And the second reason is that if it's warmer, mosquitoes become more active. And if it's wetter, then mosquitoes can more easily breed because they need warm, still standing water to lay their egg in. So you would expect both the parasite to be more active in the future, and mosquitoes to be more active and more prevalent. And then if you have more malaria, faster malaria, you have more mosquitoes carrying malaria around, then you would expect an increase in the incidence of the disease. This is a map of the current, or rather more recent spread of the disease. And there's 5 colors on this map. In red, you're looking at those areas where there is malaria. In yellow, you're looking at those areas of the world where there can be malaria, but there isn't. And then in blue and in green and in white, you're looking at those areas where there can't be malaria for various reasons, and that's the different colors. But the crucial bits are the yellow and the red. So what is the difference between the yellow and the red? For natural reasons, there can be malaria. It's warm enough, it's wet enough. So why is there no malaria? The obvious difference between the red and the yellow is wealth. Right? This is where the rich people are, this is where the poor people are. This is where the rich people are, this is where the poor people are. That is the obvious difference between the yellow and the red. Now, this is not some sort of correlation, this is causation. There's essentially 3 reasons why rich people don't get malaria, or don't die of malaria rather. The first has to do with the cycle of the disease. So malaria is one of those symbiotic parasites. It needs to spend some time in the mosquito, then it needs to spend some time in a human host, then it needs to spend some time in a mosquito host, and so on and so forth. And it needs to go through that cycle. It can't just survive in the mosquito, it can't just survive in the humans, it has to have both hosts. If you treat a human who has malaria with malaria medicine, then there's 2 effects. One, you don't get ill, or not as ill as you would have been without the medicine, but also you don't become infectious. And if there's no infectious humans around, because they're all treated with malaria medicine, then you create herd immunity, because the parasite needs the humans to survive. So in those parts of the world where access to malaria medicine is common, you create herd immunity. A dose of malaria medicine costs about $100, 75 pounds, which is not a lot for us. It is quite a lot of money if you're living on $1 a day. So if we contract malaria, we just go to the doctor, and hopefully the doctor recognizes that we have malaria, gives us a dose of medicine, and we won't become infectious to other people. So that is the first reason. The second reason has to do with essentially clouds of malaria. So until 1946, malaria was endemic in Sardinia and Sicily. Earlier on, there were outbreaks of malaria as far north as Stockholm. Rumors of outbreaks of malaria in Murmansk. George Washington did not want Washington, D.C. to be built in the marshes of the Potomac because of the malaria risk. They ignored him and built D.C. there anyway. But after World War II, for about 15 years, essentially we covered this part of the US and this part of Europe in clouds of DDT, killing all the mosquitoes. And that greatly helped reduce the risk of malaria. And then as soon as malaria was sort of gone from the rich part of the world, Rachel Carson wrote Siren Spring and all that sort of stuff, and we started worrying about birds, and then we banned DDT before we could drive malaria out of Brazil and before we could drive malaria out of Africa. Bit unfortunate consequence of the early environmental movement. So that is the second reason. The third reason, as I said, mosquitoes need small pools of warm, still standing water to breed. And you've seen by now the pictures of particularly the Brazilian program against Zika, right? So what does the military do? They go and they sort out all the little puddles of warm water and put some sort of chemical in to kill the eggs. Now, what did we do with our puddles of water? Actually, we surfaced the roads. We put better roofs on our houses. And as soon as you do that, you reduce the habitat of the mosquito. We also drain a lot of wetlands. As soon as you do that, you reduce the habitat of the mosquito. And that is actually the most important reason why we don't have malaria anymore in Europe and the United States. We simply destroyed the habitat, or large parts of the habitat of the mosquito. So there's a causal relationship here, right? Poverty implies vulnerability to malaria. So what does this imply for the future? Well, here we're looking at a whole bunch of scenarios that describe what could happen with malaria in the future. And this is an older picture, but I'll update you about what is going on. So in blue, we're looking at the effect of climate change on malaria. And the only thing that is changing in this scenario is that the world gets warmer and wetter. What we would see is that at the moment, when this model was calibrated, about 500,000 people died each year because of malaria, mostly children in Africa, actually. And that number would have been lower by about 70,000 were it not for the climate change over the last century. And then that number would go up to about 300,000, 250,000, a quarter of a million in the year 2100 because of the warming and wettening of tropical Africa. Now this 500,000 people dying each year of malaria is a guess, because most of the people who die of malaria don't have proper or access to proper health care, and there's nobody who's filling out a death certificate, so it's a bit unclear what the actual number is. And for that same reason, there's also no death certificates that say this person died of climate change related malaria rather than common malaria, right? So these are all essentially model reconstructions of what today is like. So that is if climate is the only thing that changes, and then the dotted lines are the uncertainty about the malaria model, not the uncertainty about climate change or anything, just the uncertainty about the malaria model. Then in green you're looking at a scenario where both climate changes and population grows, and then you're talking about 750,000 people dying each year just because of climate change related malaria. And this is the number that some environmentalists are very keen on showing. And then in red, the consistent scenario of economic growth is imposed, where the assumption here is that once your income exceeds $3,000 per person per year, then you sort of have the wherewithal to control malaria effectively. And if you impose that assumption, then you incline to that, then malaria goes away around 2085. Not just the climate change part of malaria, but all malaria goes away around 2085. So you can sort of see the mechanisms here. Climate change is driving up malaria. If there's more people around, then obviously you would have more cases of the disease. But then economic growth takes away part of your concern. Now the economic growth part is particularly uncertain, and that is illustrated in the purple, and the yellowish brown. This assumes the healthcare spending that is sort of average across the world. If instead we have the healthcare spending that is common in communist countries or socialist countries, then malaria would go away much, much faster. This is following the example of countries like Cuba and China, who spend much more on healthcare than their income would suggest. Then malaria goes away much faster. But of course the disease is concentrated in Africa, and if we impose African standards of healthcare spending, then we're actually following the purple line, and the disease would still bend down, but not nearly as fast as if we follow the world average value. And so that is a key uncertainty in this. So how does, because a lot of the things that I talked about are essentially public programs of healthcare rather than private programs of healthcare. And the way the government responds is crucially important, and of course very unpredictable. Now there is, in addition, this already begins to tell a fairly complicated story, right? Climate, there's population growth, there's economic growth, there is how the government responds to economic growth. and what they use their additional resources for, what are their priorities in spending. But there is an additional complication. That is where this graph is really outdated. This medical technology. When I started in researching climate change, it's 25 years ago, there were serious malaria researchers, serious medical doctors, who claimed that you could not invent a malaria vaccine because the disease was just too complicated. It was simply technically impossible to do so. And then around the year 2000, Bill Gates said, screw you, we're going to do it anyway. And they announced a very major program on developing vaccines for neglected diseases, particularly malaria. And their initial plan was to have the vaccine ready by 2020. It took us about 20 years to roll out the polio vaccine across the world, so that is the assumption here, that the Gates Foundation, unlike Microsoft, delivers on time in 2020, and it takes 20 years to roll out the vaccine and wipe out malaria across the world. And if that is the case, then of course all your concerns about climate change-induced malaria go away. And actually all your concerns about malaria go away. The Gates Foundation did not deliver on time. They delivered before time. The first trials of the vaccine were in 2011. The commercial rollout is expected this year or next year. And this vaccine doesn't just treat against climate change-induced malaria, right? It's all malaria. So what do we learn from this, right? Why do I spend so much time talking about one particular aspect? The impacts of climate change is the next. One, because I think it actually illustrates what is going on there, but also it leads us to the policy implications, the Schelling conjecture. Tom Schelling is a recent Nobel laureate in economics, mostly for his work in game theory, but he's also dabbled in climate change, and despite his status, he's actually a very naughty man. In the mid-1990s, he asked two key questions about climate policy. And the first is, most of greenhouse gas emissions come from rich countries. Most of the impacts of climate change will fall on poor countries. So climate policy is an implicit transfer of income. It is not something that we do for ourselves because of the delays in the ocean and the carbon cycle and what have you. So climate policy and greenhouse gas emission reduction is never something we do for ourselves. It's something we do for future generations. But because rich people emit most, poor people suffer most of the consequences, climate policy is something that we do for, not for our grandchildren, but it's something that we do for the grandchildren of the current poor. And if we look at our trade policy, our aid policy, our migration policy, we don't care about the Bangladeshis. We don't care about the people in Cameroon. But through climate policy, we all of a sudden express a desire to help the grandchildren of the people in Bangladesh and the grandchildren of the people in Cameroon. Isn't that very peculiar, that we care about the grandchildren of people we don't care about? So that's one thing that Schelling says, and as I said, he's a bit naughty. There's no answer to this question. The second implication is immediately, well, if we accept that we do care about the grandchildren of the Bangladeshis, is greenhouse gas emission reduction the obvious way to help them? Is emission reduction the best way of reducing the impacts of climate change? Or if we are talking about Bangladesh, would we not rather go in and build dikes for them? Or if we are concerned about the impacts of climate change on malaria, is the best way to reduce the impacts of malaria to push down the blue line, that is reduce greenhouse gas emissions, or is it to push the brown line, develop a vaccine? And for malaria, that question has been answered. Actually, Bill Gates essentially has taken away this impact of climate change by pushing technology rather than by pushing emission reduction. The answer to Schelling's second question is obvious if you're talking about malaria. It may be obvious if we're talking about other impacts of climate change. The question, do we go into Bangladesh and build dikes for them, of course opens up a whole conundrum of, do we actually have the right to intervene at this level in another country? Does it actually make sense that foreigners come and sort your problems for you? Would we not rather have the Bangladeshis solve their own problems? Actually, the World Bank has been trying to build dikes around Bangladesh for 30 or more years by now, without much success, because there's no indigenous support, essentially. So that is not very effective. Really, if you believe what I said before, what Bangladesh needs is a proper government. That's very easily said, but very hard to do. And it's definitely not something that you can solve by spending money. It's not that you can just, well, if you put 10 billion on the table or perhaps 100 billion on the table, then all of a sudden Bangladeshi politicians will behave properly. Now I forget his name. Is it Mustafa? Has tried this in Africa, right? And they just put this prize on the table, hopefully taking away the incentives to be corrupt for African leaders. Right, I mean, he hasn't awarded the prize for a number of years now. Yes, if there were a magic wand that we could sort of wave, or just money being put on the table that would stimulate development, then it may well be that that is a much better way of reducing vulnerability or reducing the impacts of climate change and greenhouse gas emission reduction. But as we don't know how to stimulate development, we know it a little bit, to be fair to my colleagues, then this is the answer to the Schelling conjecture is not immediately obvious. Said all this, let's turn gears a little bit and do one additional complication. So far, I've been talking about the impacts of climate change in a static sense. The graph that I showed about these impacts was essentially sort of comparative static, with and without climate change. And then I talked about the effects of developmental vulnerability, which sort of brought dynamics into the picture. But I haven't talked about what happens to economic growth if climate changes. So that's the dynamics in the opposite direction. So what happens to economic growth if climate changes? Well, we talked about the impacts of climate change fairly extensively. And this, essentially, climate change can affect human welfare through four channels. There's stuff that affects our utility, but doesn't affect our economic activity. For instance, the extinction of butterfly species would make at least me feel sad, maybe you as well, but it would not change the way I spend money or the way I supply labor or anything. We also talked about the health effects of climate change, and if people are ill more often because of climate change, then obviously they supply less labor, and the stock of labor goes down, and the same is true if people are dying prematurely. It may also be that labor productivity goes down because we can't work as hard because it's so hot and humid outside. It may also be that the complements to our labor, if you're a farmer and because of climate change your crops don't grow as well and you suffer more bad harvests, then of course the output per farmer goes down. And finally what can happen is that with floods and storms, your roads may wash away, your buildings may get damaged, and that would also reduce output because of interruptions. But if capital is damaged by storms and floods, then you can actually see this as a form of forced depreciation, and you need to invest more to replace it. And if all these effects are negative, and that is the way I talk about it, then what you would have is that economic output would fall. Now, if output falls today, that means that we consume less, there's less money to go around, but we also save less because there's less money to go around to save. And if we save less, then we invest less, and that means that next year there will be less productive capital around. And if there's less productive capital around next year, then there will be less output next year. And even if climate change has stopped, there will still be less output next year. And that means that there is a dynamic effect on economic growth as well, apart from the static effect. These are static effects, but because of the impacts of climate change today, there will be less output in the future. Now, you can argue that, well, perhaps we can overcome these negative effects by investing more. Less output today, let's increase the savings rate so that we maintain the capital stock as it otherwise would have been. That doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any intuitive sense because output is lower today, therefore consumption is lower today. In order to invest more, we need to reduce our consumption even more. And immediately see that that is perhaps not an easy thing to do. But also, just rationally, the returns to capital have fallen, right? Because climate change makes us less productive today. That also means that the returns to capital have fallen. And that means that you would actually have a desire to invest less rather than more. And that slightly strengthens this. Now, how important are these effects? They're actually fairly important. So what you're looking at here is the result of a calibrated model exercise. In the bottom line, the diamonds, you're looking at assumptions about what the comparative static or the direct cost effect of climate change would be. And then this is used as an input to 4 alternative economic growth models that you should recall from macro. One is the solo model, sort of the 1950s technologies, where technological change is exogenous, right? Technology just improves for whatever reason. And the solo model, of course, also has a fixed savings rate. So really the effect here is lower output today, less savings, therefore less capital tomorrow, and therefore less output tomorrow, and so on and so forth. And that is what's going on here. And if you believe that this is a correct representation of the economy, then what you see is that the indirect effect, the economic growth effects, are actually slightly higher than the static effects. And that immediately implies that we should double the impact estimates that we were talking about before. So this is what it would cost in a static sense, this is what it would cost in a dynamic sense, and then the two should be added up. Total welfare loss is then the sum of the two. That's how you should read this. So that is the solo model. Then we show the Ramsey model. And the Ramsey model differs from the solo model because it endogenizes savings. So savings is no longer a fixed share of output, but it's the optimal share of output. And what you see is that the triangles and the squares cannot be seen. There's no distinction between the two. So there's sort of the effect on the savings rate is minimal. And then we show 2 new growth models. The Romer model, so this is the David Romer implementation of the Paul Romer model, where investment in new blueprints is endogenized, the development of new knowledge is endogenized. And what then happens is that a greater part of the economy is endogenous, which means that the greater part of the economy can be affected by climate change. And you indeed see, as you would expect, that the impacts go up, but only slightly. And then the other model is the Mencken-Romer-Weil model, which endogenizes essentially education. And you introduce a human capital stock into the model. And again, what then happens is that a greater part of the economy is endogenous. In the solo model, 75% of economic growth is because of technological change that is not in the model and therefore cannot be affected by climate change. In the Mencken-Romer-Weil model, a much larger part of the economic growth is inside the model and therefore can be affected by climate change. And what you see is a much larger impact of climate change. These are 2 sort of simple theoretical models that can easily be stuck in a graph and stuck in a computer. Most empiricists would argue that the Romer model is not sensitive enough. It cannot explain, for instance, the current distribution of income across the world. It would suggest that Africans should be much richer than they are. No, should be much poorer than they are, sorry. Whereas the Mencken-Romer-Weil model is too sensitive. That is, it predicts that Africans should be much richer than they are. And the income distribution should be much more egalitarian. And most empiricists would say the truth lies somewhere in between this line and this line. These are just two bounding cases in theory. So the takeaway message here is that the impact estimates that I showed you before, 1-2% of GDP, are just the static ones, and if you add the dynamic ones, you should actually double those numbers, or maybe triple those numbers to get to the true effect of climate change. Dynamic effects are important. Climate change will not reverse economic growth, so this is the assumption about economic growth, that there will no climate change. And then what you see is that climate change, yes, reduces the economic growth rate, but it does not reverse economic growth. Of course, you can do this in the theoretical model, but then you need to put in so many crazy assumptions that you just would never go there.